everyone, welcome to the October 13th edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski and a special guest that'll be joining us this week. Before we welcome him in, I'll just note that this week's podcast will be taking a look at Keeneland on Saturday. Our focus is the late pick 5 sequence there. The feature race is the Grade 1 Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, that a race over 9 furlongs for the 3-year-old fillies, and it's drawn one of the best fields that I can really remember for this race going back probably decades. We've got some top runners coming over from Europe, a European Classic winner in the race, some strong American runners too, though they could be up against it just based on those foreign contenders. So that's a really strong and competitive affair. It's a sequence that does feature plenty of favorites, and we'll talk about whether any of them are beatable. Some of them do look pretty strong, but I'm sure we'll get into that as we handicap the podcast. And Craig, I know that you were corresponding a little bit with our guest earlier this week, and happy to have Mike Maloney back on the podcast. I know that we had him on, I believe, just over a year ago to talk about Keeneland. I think that was back in the springtime, and always enjoy talking to Mike. And Mike, happy to have you back on the TimeformUS Forecast.
Thanks, David. I'm glad to be on with you guys, two of the sharpest guys in racing, and I'm looking forward to doing a little handicapping with you.
And Craig, we've got a pretty interesting sequence to talk about, as I was saying. A lot of favorites in the sequence that look like they're going to be strong, particularly early on, and especially in the last leg with the return of First Mission, that horse that was scratched out of the Preakness earlier this year. But it does seem like an approachable pick 5 sequence if you do have some opinions in those races.
I'll admit I was a bit overwhelmed at first when I saw 4 fields of 12, a field of 11, and almost all the races have AEs. And I was like, holy cow, how am I going to be able to play this ticket? Because those are the kind of field sizes where, I mean, it's possible you could get a life-changing score if you come up with some crazy horses. But as you go through the sequence, I think some of these races you can whittle down. There's always going to be some filler at a meet like Keeneland where people just want to run there. I think you can narrow these down somewhat, but I'm not by any means saying it's an easy sequence.
Now, Mike, I know that you're focused on the Kentucky circuit, Keeneland especially, and I guess I just want to ask if you've noticed any trends, not so much at this meet, because I know it just started last week, but anything that's particular to the Keeneland fall meet. I know that you're somebody that likes to track trainer statistics or other types of trends with tracks and how they're playing. Anything that we should be looking out for that maybe is a little counterintuitive to the general narrative out there?
I don't know about counterintuitive, David, and I don't have anything that's really pronounced, and often I will by this time in a meet, but I'm always looking for people that are, in a cold streak, or what I'm really looking for is are they showing signs of coming out of that, where I can possibly take advantage of that, and especially if they're very competent trainers, riders, whatever. And Ian Wilkes, I think, may be an example of that. He's been in a extended slump in Kentucky for several months, and he's always been a streaky trainer. His mentor, Carl Nafsker, was the same way. I may be telling my age there, but Wilkes has shown signs to me just in the last few racing days that he may be coming out of that. So I'm going to pay special attention to his horses, a couple more sharp runs, improved performances out of his stable, and I'll be looking to, specifically try to take advantage of that. And just an overall comment, and this is not breaking any news, I don't guess, but Cherie DeVoe appears to be ready to break out in a big way, and she's already in the process of doing that. But her current situation in racing reminds me a lot of Brendan Walsh a few years ago, where they were a known trainer, but they made a leap forward, and I think the DeVoe stable's ready to do that. They're in a great situation with David Ngordo. The spouse is one of the best bloodstock agents in the country, so with his eye at the sales And Cherie's talent as a trainer, I look for that stable to do big things in the next few months.
Yeah, I love insights like that. I mean, I'm somebody that does take a look at those 5-year stats in DRF Formulator quite a bit, trying to deduce what certain barns do well. But figuring out which barns are in a hot streak or a cold streak is something that is also really important. I think that's good information about Ian Wilkes, because barns go through cycles, and not to suggest that there's anything going on that's that's nefarious or anything like that, but I mean, it's just momentum in sports. I mean, sometimes things are going well, sometimes everything's going wrong. That's just the way luck seems to flow in racing and really anything in any endeavor. So I think that's good information, and I completely agree with your assessment of Cherie DeVoe. It just feels like there's just been this steady rise in quality in the barn and a greater consistency of the performances coming out of her stable. So definitely a barn to look out for, both at this meet and in the coming months. Well, let's get into the handicapping action, because as Craig said, there's a lot to go through in this sequence. We've got a lot of large fields. Like I said, clearly defined favorites in a few of these races, but definitely many horses you can make a case for if you're looking beyond them. So we'll kick things off with race 6. It is a maiden special weight event going 1 mile and a 16th for the 2-year-olds. Of course, this is the 2-turn race with the short stretch run at Keeneland, so you do want to be cognizant of that, especially given the fact that this is a 12-horse field, and we have the morning line favorite, the number 12 Dive Bomber, drawn on the far outside, so got to overcome that post position. I'll throw it to you first, Mike, because this is one of those races where it feels like there are a couple of horses that are going to take the bulk of play in here, those being, of course, Dive Bomber, as well as the number 2 Dornoch, who has been a highly touted horse for Danny Gargan and has run pretty well in both starts, but it feels like most of the public is probably going to gravitate towards these two. How do you assess them?
I think that Dive Bomber is clearly the horse with the most potential in this race. But you mentioned the post, David, and I totally agree with that. You'll take some bad beats if you're consistently betting the 12 horse in 1 mile and a 16th dirt races at Keeneland. So while I think Dive Bomber is probably the most likely winner, in a pick 5 sequence, I want to have another horse included on my top line, and that horse is going to be Lat Long for me. McPeak has long been one of the very best on the Kentucky circuit, and I really think in the country at stretching 2-year-olds out. That I did a quick formulator search, 2-year-olds first route on dirt, 18% winners, 278 ROI for McPeak, and that's this horse showed enough in his first race that he could easily move forward enough to, with the stretch out, to get there in this race. So I'm leaning toward making those A's in my setup, and then I saw a few other horses that I would throw in, on the bottom line.
Well, Craig, Mike brought up another horse, Lat Long, which I agree is definitely a contender in this race. How are you viewing the favorite Dive Bomber in that 12 post, and who else are you looking at in here?
Well, he certainly has the best speed figures by a pretty good margin in here. So just because of the post, I'm not going to totally dismiss Dive Bomber by any means. I think he's the most likely winner, and I'll definitely use him. But I have 2 other horses I want to use. The first one is Lat Long, and if I had to make a top pick, he would probably be it. And it's for most of the reasons Mike said. No reason to rehash those. He has good statistics with this kind of move, and that horse actually has run faster than Dornoch has on TimeformUS speed figures in just one race. So I like him quite a bit. The other one is Greer's Ferry, the Wayne Lucas horse, who is coming out of what was a pretty strong maiden race with a good speed figure. Generous Tipper, who won that race, came back to be a good third, I believe it was, in the Breeders' Futurity, improving his speed figure. The 4th place finisher that day broke his maiden next out with a slightly improved speed figure, then ran 4th in the Breeders' Futurity. So I don't think that 96 he ran that day was any fluke, and I think he might get overlooked a bit and is a horse that has some talent.
Yeah, I agree with what you guys are saying about Dive Bomber. I mean, he's coming out of some pretty strong races at Saratoga. We've talked a lot about how productive that Valentine Candy race has been, where he debuted and actually took money that day and really didn't run that badly with a somewhat uncomfortable trip. And then I thought he was really game chasing home General Partner last time, and that horse obviously came back to run a big race in the Champagne. Brad Cox does have great stats with horses going from sprints to routes after in their third start, so like 2 sprints to a route on the dirt. Not a positive ROI, kind of sitting just under that, but he's winning, about 34% of those races. So he makes a ton of sense, and I don't anticipate the distance is going to get him beat here, but you do have to worry a little about that post position. I think that you guys threw out some valid points about Lat Long. He's a horse that I could definitely use here. But I think the number 2 Dornoch is a legitimate player in here, and maybe he's going to be a clear second choice, but I think he's actually deserving of vying for favoritism in this spot because he's another horse that came into Saratoga with a big reputation. Some of that was probably due to some of the statements made by his trainer, Danny Gargan, who I think called him the best horse he's ever trained. Still has a long way to go to live up to that. But this horse ran fine on debut. Just seemed like he was getting an education that day. And then when they stretched him out in the sapling last time at Monmouth, that's a trip that's really worth watching because this horse got pushed out pretty significantly into the clubhouse turn. And then Kendrick Carmouche made this pretty abrupt move back to the inside, almost cutting off the horse that had fouled him and then getting to the 2 path where this horse made a nice move up to contest the pace down the backstretch. Just like a 2-year-old like this that's inexperienced that can make multiple moves within a race. And yeah, he got run down by Noted at the end, and maybe that horse is ultimately more of a turf horse, but I thought Dornoch battled back pretty gamely at the end. He's already gone the 2 turns, and he's drawn much better than his main rival Dive Bomber. So I just think he makes a lot of sense in here. I don't love taking Danny Gargan in Kentucky as much as I would Brad Cox, but probably going to get a better price because of that. So I think I'd make Dornoch my top pick in this race, and I'd probably use him primarily with Dive Bomber in this first leg with a little bit of Lat Long. If this race were a little bit less top heavy in terms of quality, I'd want to consider a horse like the number 7 Play It Loud, because he feels like a horse to me that they just ran on turf first time to get him the distance. He didn't really look like a turf horse to me in that race, just kind of staying on with a grinding style at one pace. And now he's making a switch to Michael Stidham. He's got a big dirt route pedigree, especially on the dam side. So he feels like one that still has some upside, but it just feels like this might be too tough a race for a horse like that. So maybe he's more a horse to use underneath in exotics. So it sounds like we're all kind of leaning towards the favorites in this first leg. Mike, would you keep it pretty simple here? Is there anybody else like a Play It Loud or a bigger price that you'd want to potentially use as a backup?
I had 4 horses on that bottom line, and that's more than I would like to have there. But I had Dornoch, of course. I think it's interesting with Dornoch being a half to Mage and showing kind of the same profile in that, not exactly, but Mage showed speed sprinting and then became more of an off the pace horse routing. And Dornoch seems to be like on that same path, which I just thought was interesting. I had Dornoch, Greer's Ferry, who Craig already discussed, Play It Loud, who Craig discussed. The only other horse I would throw in, and this is probably a reach, or definitely a reach, would be Nuevo Empire. And it showed a little potential in that first race, came out terribly. I really don't believe the horse has any speed. I think he'll be a deep closer again, but this is not very scientific, I guess, but Gaffleon has just, he's won me over with some of the horses that he's gotten home at this Keeneland meet so far. And I've just kind of taken the approach, if I can see him even really having to squint, if I can see him possibly winning, I want to throw him in on the bottom line at least.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up Nuevo Empire. He is a little interesting in this race. Just stayed on gamely in the debut. That was not a race that featured a particularly fast pace, and you make a great point about Tyler Gaffaleo being the right kind of rider you want from an outside post like this, because it is tough to win from there, but at least this is a horse that figures to drop back early. But again, one of those horses that has to take a big step forward if the favorites run the kinds of races that we're expecting them to. Let's move on to the next leg of this sequence, race 7, and we're stretching all the way out to 1.5 miles on the turf. This one for the 3-year-old and up runners. It's an N2X allowance race, $120,000 purse, and there's a heavy favorite on the morning line here in the number 1, 911 Turbo. And Craig, I'm going to throw it to you first, because I remember we discussed this horse when we were handicapping Del Mar back in the beginning of September. I think that was on the Pacific Classic card that this horse last ran. And I know you were kind of making a case for this horse at a price that day, and he actually outran his odds at 13-1 to be second in a photo behind Gold Phoenix. He is a horse that's gotten pretty good trips in Southern California, but it seems like he's appreciated the stretch out to 1 mile and 3/8. And I guess just based on those recent form lines and his propensity to win races that he is the horse to beat in this race, but 6-5 seems a little short on the line.
Definitely seems short to me. And you said early on we were going to have to decide about some favorites, and I decided pretty quickly on this one. I'm not using him in this spot. I don't know if he's really going to be 6-5. I think he'll probably be favored. 6-5 seems a little bit much to me. When you really look at his form, I mean, he was a horse who didn't have a whole lot of success when he was running in Kentucky. Shipped out to California. It took him a little while, but he suddenly became a really good horse. And that's not a big surprise, because the racing out in Southern California, particularly on the turf and going long, is just nowhere near the same level as it is on the East Coast. So I think his form may be not quite as good as what it looks. I'm not a big fan of moving from those turf courses out in Southern California to the East Coast. He's been in races with a ton of red fractions, something he's probably not going to see here. So I'm definitely going to take a stand against him, and I'll just throw out a couple horses that I do like in here. One of them is the 4-horse Sharar. He's a horse who looks to me like he just wants to go further. That's what he did his best when he was in Maidan. Had a nice win at 1.25 miles. He's just a 3-year-old, by the way, and he just seems to be improving, but he couldn't quite he wasn't running in longer races. Last time at Kentucky Downs, he stretched out to 1 mile and 5/16, ran a good second in what was a fast race. And we know 1 mile and 5/16 is more like 1 mile and 3/8 there at Kentucky Downs, because of how long the run-ups are, running up and down hills and stuff, so it's not quite the same. But he's just one I think is set to run a big one at a longer distance. And similar for the 6-horse Foreign Relations, I'm ignoring his Turf Cup last time. That was one of those speed crazy days where even Get Smokin' was able to get 1.5 miles. But if you look before that, he's a horse who should love 1.5 miles. He has done it a few times, won easily, has moved way up in class because of that. Didn't have success, but didn't run terribly either. So I will definitely be using Foreign Relations, as I just think he has a little bit dirtied up form. And the other horse I wanted to mention is the 10, who's also a big price on the morning line. I don't know if this horse will actually be 20-1 with Brad Cox training, but the horse moved the turf, stretched out to 1.25 miles, overcame a pretty slow pace, and was able to get the job done. His speed figure's a little bit light, but I expect him to keep improving, and I think he's got a shot in here as well. So definitely looking to beat the favorite 911 Turbo.
Yeah, this definitely feels like a race where a lot of players are going to identify 911 Turbo as one of the more vulnerable favorites in the sequence, just because given the distance and how muddled the rest of the field looks and the fact that he is a horse that's gotten such good trips recently coming in from California, there are some questions. There's a little more uncertainty to this race, I guess is a better way to put it. But just being against a favorite in a race like this isn't enough because, if you're spreading here, it's going to kind of tie your hands a little bit with what you can do in some other legs that are very competitive. So how are you viewing this one, Mike? I mean, maybe you like 911 Turbo quite a bit. I don't know, but it feels like an important race in the sequence because you're going to have to identify some horses at maybe bigger prices that you want to upgrade.
I agree. It is an important race in the sequence, and what I'm doing to cut to the chase is I'm making A's 911 Turbo and Foreign Relations and using Sherrar as a B. But my reasons for that are not that I think 911 Turbo is really worth the 6-5. I don't. But Pratt, I think this horse is really going to suit Pratt's riding style. And the inside and tactical speed are preferable, in my experience, at these 1.5 mile turf races at Keeneland. So I think some of the elements outside maybe the trip elements and the track structure bias elements are in favor of 911 Turbo. I really believe Foreign Relations' best race is probably better than 911 Turbo. I agree on throwing out his last race at Kentucky Downs. That was maybe the most speed favoring day we had there, and his United Nations race I think is very likely to be good enough to win this race. So and you get Gaffleon, so. He's a must-use for me. And then Sherrar for the reasons that Craig laid out. And Pletcher is having an excellent meet, and this horse appears to be just improving and lightly raced. And those type of horses are dangerous. So for me, it's just those three, and Sherrar, a lot less than the other two.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to frame this race because you have to acknowledge that 911 Turbo and Foreign Relations, they've just run the most reliable races going this distance and have done it against the best company. I guess the way that I would draw or make the difference between these two horses is I feel like Foreign Relations has true stamina, and he's shown it, and he could get 1.5 miles at Keeneland. My issue with 911 Turbo is I wonder if 1.5 miles at Keeneland is really going to suit this horse, because a marathon at Del Mar with the short stretch there is a very different thing than getting a marathon trip at Keeneland, where you've got the long stretch to deal with, a more demanding turf course in general, especially if we do get a little bit of rain. And it's just a different kind of race for this horse. And he's only gone the 1 3/8 twice at Del Mar. He's been more of a conventional, 1 to 9 furlong router for much of his career. So to me, he's just got a little bit more to prove than a horse like Foreign Relations when it comes to this course configuration and distance. So he'd be one that 911 Turbo would be one that I'm looking to downgrade a little bit, because I do think there are some other interesting horses in here. I won't rehash Foreign Relations. I agree with most of what you guys were saying about him. I think he's a contender in this race. I'm a little bothered by his last race, because even though that was a speed-dominated race, he had forward position, and he was on the rail where you wanted to be, and just was done a long way out. I mean, he was under a ride on the far turn. It just seemed like it was something beyond just that being a speed-favoring race. He didn't run that day. But it is Kentucky Downs. Sometimes you can be forgiving of those races. Sherrar and Quadra Island, I also agree that they're interesting horses in here. I'll just throw out a couple of others. Well, one other in particular. The number 2, Altazor, who is guaranteed to be a big price in this race, just doesn't have a particularly appealing profile. His race last time at Kentucky Downs is one that piques my interest a little bit, because that was a really tough field. Wolfie's Dynagos and Ocean Atlantique, and this horse held his own against those. I mean, he was wide, 2 to 3 path most of the way, was closing down the center of the course, and was right there with some of those classy, talented older rivals at the end of the race. it was only going a mile, and he really has no form going this far. But just watching him, he's this kind of big, rangy, high-striding horse that strikes me as one that's more of a galloping type, and maybe he could go these longer distances. He tried 1.25 miles a few times in South America. Obviously, he's a much better horse in the United States than he was south of the border, but he just feels like a horse that is unexposed going this distance, and he's coming out of a race that I'm just looking at TimeformUS. He's got a 119 TimeformUS race rating compared to today's race, which is just a 116. So it's actually a drop in class, and I kind of agree with that for Altazor. And if he gets the distance, it's a big if. But if he does, I think he's a horse that's going to offer some real value in this race. So he's one that I definitely want to upgrade. And I'm looking for some others in here because the pace does seem like it's a little bit murky, and I think we probably should discuss the pace a little bit. And Craig, it's one that's really tough to read because the number 9 Montauk Point is shown on the lead, but in his lone turf race, he was dragged to the back of the pack and became a 1-run closer. So it's really hard to know how this race is going to be run. And I guess that's maybe another reason to respect 911 Turbo, because he just seems, especially with Pratt, like Mike was saying, the kind of horse that can make his own good trip.
Yeah, I would, if the pace projector, I wouldn't argue with it because I wouldn't want to try to make one manually. I have absolutely no clue who's going to the front. Flavien Pratt can be aggressive when he needs to be. So if I had to pick one, it would be 911 Turbo. I just, at a short price, I'm really skeptical he would be able to see it out, even if he does get things his own way on the front end.
Yeah, and Mike, I don't know if you had much else to add about this race, either from a dynamic standpoint or any other horses you wanted to mention. I know Craig threw out a few prices, but it sounds like you're going to mostly have your A horses be 911 Turbo and Formulations. Who are some of the Bs or Cs that you'd be looking at?
The only B that I have is Shirar. So I'll live or die with those three. And I agree with what you guys are saying about the pace situation. It's hard to predict how that's going to play out. What I always worry about that. And it if you get a false pace at this 1.5 mile distance, I've seen it play out several times over the years where an inferior horse can go coast to coast. But I have enough confidence in Pratt and Gaffleon. I think they're the two riders that are regulars at this Keeneland meet that really take advantage of these type of situations of murky paces. They're both so tactical. They're smart riders, and most often they find themselves, or they put themselves in the proper spot, determinant on how the pace actually plays out in the race. So because of the riders, I'm going to, that's one of the big factors in me just sticking to the three horses and not looking for others.
Yeah, and I guess that's another thing that I was sort of hoping for with Altazor. I won't say I have confidence, but he feels like one of the horses that could be set forward in this race, just given the fact that he's attended some much faster paces going shorter. But obviously, he's got some things to prove in here, but will be a price. Let's move on to the next race in this sequence, race 8. It is an N1X allowance affair. This one going the shorter distance of 6.5 furlongs on the dirt for the fillies, 3-year-olds and up. And this is another allowance race that feels like it's highly competitive. Unlike the one we just talked about, it does not feature a clearly defined favorite. I'm not even exactly sure who the favorite's going to be in this race. I guess horses like the number 2 Pumpkin Scone and perhaps the number 10 Exceed will vie for favoritism, but it's a pretty confusing race to sift through. I'll throw it to you first, Mike, because there are a lot of horses coming off layoffs, horses that have shown promise but have a lot of questions to answer.
Yeah, this is the murky race with a capital M for me in this sequence. I'm one thing I will do is I will play a very small all in this race with my very top opinions in the other races, and I laid that out quickly in my head. I think for $60 something, I could get my top picks in the other legs with an all in here. So I'm definitely going to do that because There's no one in this race that I can eliminate and just say absolutely not, can't do it. Um, I do have three horses I see a little above the others, but I have questions about the three that I like. But I will uh, use them the most, and in other legs where I'm using B horses, I'll have to narrow down in this race. So the first of those would be the 10, a seed. I think this pace is going to. It looks like it has to have a fast pace. So I'm looking for horses that have a little finish, and I think a seed's best race would suit a fast pace, and she would be the best horse. I just don't trust that I'm going to get her best race. She's my top choice because if she does fire, I think she gets there, but there are question marks about her. And the main question mark is just, is she really on form? I'm going to say yes, that she is, but I don't have a high level of confidence in that. The last race at Kentucky Downs did show some run. I thought the inside was preferable that day, and she was 3 or 4 wide. So that's probably an excusable race. And hoping that Chad's got her back to her best. Another one of the contenders for me would be Dear Lady, the 5 for McPeak. Um, Her last race is a toss for me, a turf route experiment, but something that's probably good for fitness. Um, Also has some finish, fits the shape of the race. The other contender would be the 9 Zeitlos. Um, has has a forward position, a forward running style in some of her races, but then in other races has shown that she doesn't have a problem passing horses. And anytime I can include a Curlin filly that has 6 starts lifetime, these Curlins just seem to improve with racing, and they get better and better, and she fits that profile where she could take another step forward. So those would be the three that I would lean on a little bit. But this race is it's if we have something silly happen, I'm guessing this might be the race for it.
Yeah, Craig, Mike brought up the pace, and I think it's an important point to make in this race. There are a lot of fillies that have been enjoying forwardly placed trips, either against maidens or weaker company, lightly raced horses that have done so. So it does feel like there are going to be a lot of connections with intentions to go forward in this race, and it's easy to see things coming apart to some extent.
Yeah, I agree with the pace projector. I think the pace is going to be pretty quick, and I'm likewise going to use a few horses in here, but that is the reason I would make my top pick Dear Lady, who Mike mentioned. Ken McPeak horse has, I think, by far the best late pace rating in the field. And I think she's got form dirtied up a little bit. She was running well at Oaklawn this winter. Something went amiss, I would guess. She showed back up at Saratoga. Coming off a layoff is not Ken McPeak's strong suit. She didn't really show a whole lot that day. He's much better second off the layoff, but then she went to turf, so I'm just kind of putting a line through that. And it just feels like if she can get back to those winter races she was running when she was running triple digit TimeformUS speed figures, she's a 3 year old, so she should actually improve off of those if she's in form. And I think she's really dangerous in here. Another horse I wanted to mention was the outside horse for Wesley Ward, Rarify. She was a horse that lost her first couple while having a good reputation at Saratoga as a 2 year old. Broke her maiden at Keeneland, and I'm usually not a fan of these horses, but when I looked up Wesley Ward and Formulator, I just looked up 3 year olds that have been off at least 300 days. He's 10 for 28 with a 2.85 ROI. She has shown the ability to come from off the pace as well. She draws a good outside post. So those are two that I'll be using at a price. A seed I would probably use more as a backup. I just do not trust her form. She started out her career obviously very good, running 3 triple-digit figures in a row, winning first time out. She kind of got thrown to the wolves after that debut win, and maybe that's part of it. Her loss at Saratoga was to Randomized, who's obviously doing very well right now, but then she tried turf. Maybe that's a rebound, but sometimes turf can make horses look better than they are as the margins are a little compressed. I know she was against the flow, the inside outside flow that day. She was out wide, but I would use her, but more as a backup because kind of like I think what Mike was getting at. I just don't trust that she's the same horse she was early in her career.
Yeah, I've got to let Exceed beat me in this race. I've kind of had an opinion about the races she's coming out of for a while that's, I think, proven to be correct over time, and that's that 8 Bells is not living up to the speed figure it got. Not to say the speed figure was wrong, but that is one of the most negative key races that I can ever remember. Not just horses losing at it, but horses coming back to significantly regress from a speed figure standpoint. It's not just her. It's a number of horses that competed in the 8 Bells, and I was kind of skeptical of the race at the time because it got a high fig, both from you and from Buyer, Craig. I mean, it's not just one person that gave it a high fig, but it was a race where the entire field came together like an accordion at the end, and I always am skeptical of races like that, and horse after horse has come back and just not run to the form. I don't think that she wanted to go longer, so the Acorn and even the Wilton probably not the best races for her, so I like the cutback to a dirt sprint. I think that's more of the kind of horse she is. I just don't think she's that good. So maybe the pace works out for her here, but with Chad and Irad, she's probably going to take money. I don't know if she's going to be the favorite in here because she is coming off some pretty ugly running lines, but she's just not for me in this race. I agree with you guys on Dear Lady. I think she's definitely a horse that's usable in here. Third off the layoff, she showed enough quality earlier in her career and has the running style that fits the profile of this race. I initially was going through this race and expecting to be against Zeitlos because I had liked her too back at Saratoga, and I was a little disappointed in the performance, but in retrospect, 7 furlongs, probably pushing her stamina to the limit a bit, and I like that she at least showed a new dimension on the turf last time at Kentucky Downs coming from off the pace, because she had run well from off the pace in her second start of her career as a 2-year-old, albeit after a poor start, so it was kind of a forced running style that day, but I like that at least she's showing some versatility, and even though she's a daughter of Curlin, she's a smaller, compact thing, so I do really think she's much more of a sprinting type, so she's one that I could use. I do like the horse that you brought up, Craig, the number 11, Rarify. There were a lot of expectations around her last year. She was highly touted at Saratoga in 2022, and she ran pretty well behind some 2-year-olds that were just ready to go on debut, Kaling and Grand Love. But I liked that she showed that new dimension when she broke her maiden at Keeneland, coming from off the pace. Wesley Ward took the blinkers off that day, and she was able to adapt her running style. Obviously, something went wrong for her to be off for so long, and Wesley Ward admittedly does not have the best numbers coming off layoffs like this, especially in dirt sprints, but I just like the post position, drawn outside. She's not going to have to deal with a ton of kickback, and she showed that versatility to come from off the pace. So just based on pure ability, I think she's a horse that makes a lot of sense in here, and she does, speaking of pedigrees, have the potential to turn out to be very good because she's the younger half-sister to Run Happy. And then, one horse that I think I have to mention because we're kind of skipping over her, and she's a horse that probably is going to take some money in this race, is the number 2, Pumpkin Scone. I just feel like I've been burned by horses like this too many times to leave her out. Just based on the dynamics of this race and the fact that she's gotten good trips in her races coming into this, she's one that all of my handicapping instincts are telling me to dismiss in this spot. But I just look at how many times I've been beaten by horses like this, and looking up Brad Cox's stats and Formulator, specifically horses that are last out maiden winners in dirt sprints over the past 5 years. He's 38 for 130 with nearly a 30% win percentage with a $2.09 ROI. And I mean, when Brad Cox horses have a positive ROI like that, the short prices that they go off at, I think it's meaningful. And she's a horse that has shown the ability to stalk, and given the fact that she's ridden by Gerardo Corrales, maybe she's not going to take as much money as she would if she had a different rider on her back, like a Florent Giroux or a Tyler Gaffalione. But Corrales wins at a very high rate with a strong ROI for Cox, so I don't think that's any kind of negative at all. So she's a horse that I'm definitely going to use pretty prominently in this race, and maybe she won't be the favorite. So for me, it's kind of 2, 5, a little bit of 9 and especially the 11, but it's definitely one of the toughest races to narrow down in the sequence. Mike, I'll throw it back to you briefly before we wrap this race up. Is there anybody else you wanted to mention?
Not really, but I'm really glad to hear your guys' opinion on this race because I'll include those in my in my tickets and because this is a very tough race for me.
I did want to mention one more. Unfortunately, that might make Mike's ticket more expensive, but Mucho Macho Girl, the 3 horse, she's going to be a price in here. She comes off the layoff for Dallas Stewart, a guy who doesn't win a ton. And I looked up his formulator stats, and at first blush, they don't look that great coming off the layoff, but they basically match him. He's a 10% trainer. That's what he does. And what intrigues me about her is she actually ran a really good race when she ran on debut. She got a nice speed figure. It was at the fairgrounds, so maybe a little bit weaker circuit than Kentucky or New York. But when I look through the chart, it's actually been a pretty strong race. There's a lot of really good runbacks out of it. Most of the horses improved their speed figure coming out, ran better races. I don't know what went wrong. Obviously, something must have because you don't want to lay off a horse that wins that way right off the bench. But she's been working regularly, working pretty quick, and at a price I just don't want to dismiss her because she showed more talent than it might seem in that debut.
She is the younger half sister to Hoist the Gold, who just won the Phoenix for these connections earlier at the meet. But yeah, it does feel like a tough spot for a horse that showed her kind of running style on debut to come back off the layoff, especially drawn inside of a lot of other horses with speed. But I can't disagree with what you're saying, Craig. She's a horse that did show some likable attributes on debut. Let's move on to the feature race on this sequence. Race 9 is the Grade 1 Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup. 9 furlongs on the turf for the 3-year-old fillies. And Mike, I'll throw it to you first. I know I'm typically going back and forth, but I just want to kind of say this is a really interesting race from a handicapping standpoint, especially if you follow international racing, because you've got horses coming in from not just Europe, but Ireland, England, France, multiple circuits, the American contingent. You've seen a lot of editions of this race. This feels like one of the most intriguing handicapping puzzles that the Queen Elizabeth Challenge Cup has ever presented us with.
Yeah, I had that written down at the top of my PPs. I totally agree. It's the best QE2 field that I can remember. And I'm not a great judge and don't pretend to be of European form. But even I can see that these are very accomplished Euros and several of them. So yeah, it's not what I'm used to seeing in the QE2, and this is quite the field. It's a good race to handicap, and I'm excited just to watch this one.
Yeah, and Craig, it is one of these races where you have to make some comparisons between the TimeformUS speed figures or the Bayer speed figures and some of the Timeform ratings of horses coming over from Europe, because it's tough to assess the relative form of these horses coming in from various circuits, not just the Americans against the Europeans, but how strong was the English 1,000 guineas versus the French 1,000 guineas, because we've got horses coming out of both of those races. I mean, I guess you have to consider the horse to beat, the number 4 Maj, who is the 2-1 morning line favorite, and she earned a pretty gaudy Timeform rating for her last race. I think it's showing up as a 121 in our TimeformUS PPs with a bit of a weight adjustment, and that makes her just a cut above from a quality standpoint everybody else in this field. But can she run back to it?
Yeah, she's been off since then, and I mean the figure certainly checks out. The runner-up that day, Tahira, has won a couple of Group 1 since, and interestingly enough, has entered next week in the QE2 stakes at Ascot. So same name, obviously not the same race, but the form of that race has held up. I mean, she beat a very, very good horse that day. So it's just a matter of how much do you trust the layoff. I don't think they would ship her all the way to Kentucky if she wasn't ready to go. So I think she is clearly the horse to beat. We don't often see 3-year-olds ship in with dominant figures like she has. I mean, that would be competitive in older horse stakes races, something that is rare for 3-year-olds on time form ratings. So she's the horse to beat. I'm certainly not. I'm certainly using her as an A. And just to be clear, I'm using the four horses that are basically Euros, and that's it. I'm tossing the Americans. I just don't think they stack up against horses of this quality. We've seen it time and time again. But I did want to discuss the other Euro shippers. We've already seen Elusive Princess come over and just wallop the Saratoga Oaks. It wasn't the strongest field. Uh, that race is still just a grade three, but it's the purse makes it a little bit better than that, I think. And she had Group One form overseas. She had run second in a Group One at Longchamp. Um, so no knocks on her whatsoever. Maybe the soft turf helped her a little, but I don't know how soft that turf was. We have it as a 7 on the Timeform US track rating scale. I think it was more like a good track than a soft course for sure. The other ones I wanted to mention, Lindy, who showed up at Kentucky Downs after campaigning in France and did absolutely nothing wrong at 1 to 5. She wasn't a horse who rode the rail, overcame a really slow pace, something that was rare at Kentucky Downs. Ran a nice 117 Timeform US speed figure. So she could certainly win here. Wouldn't surprise me at all. And the other Euro is Sounds of Heaven, another horse that comes over with Group 1 form, having lost just a length to the aforementioned Tahira at Royal Ascot. Something went wrong her last race. Hard to say what it was. I read the Timeform comments on all this horses. They surmised the same thing, but didn't really know what it was. But if she gets back to that race at Royal Ascot, she's certainly a contender. And it's not that I just totally dismiss the Americans when they face Euros, but when you're facing good Group 1 quality like this, it just seems like a real stretch. And before I turn it to you, David, the first thing I got to hear is how disappointed were you that Friedis the Red was on the AE list?
Well, it's quite an injustice. A horse that she beat by over 14 lengths last time is in the body of the field, and she's not. But I think we got the money last time, so maybe it's for the best that she's not drawn into this field. I won't be tempted. Mike, I'll throw it back to you before I give my assessment of this race. Craig, I think rightly, brought up the advantage that the Europeans seem to have in this situation. Just they often are cut above, and it feels like we've got some proven Group 1 form among the Europeans coming into this field, but you still have to make some effort to separate them. I mean, Mauge is a weird horse to show up in this race because certainly when a horse wins the English 1000 Guineas back at the beginning of May, you're not expecting her next race to come in October at Keeneland. That's a little bit of a surprise. I mean, I don't want to second guess Godolphin because they certainly know how to win races in the United States, but it does feel like something had to have gone wrong with this horse for her to end up on this trajectory. Maybe it doesn't matter because she's shown so much ability, especially on that prior start, but it's something I think you do have to consider with a horse that is going to be a strong favorite.
Yes, and it's if you evaluate her off that last race, it's hard to get past her. Let me ask you guys this: is this her U.S. objective? Is there a chance that she goes to the Breeders' Cup from here?
So yeah, I was reading some reporting, I think in DRF, about this. Godolphin saying that they're trying to use this race to determine whether she belongs in the Breeders' Cup Mile or the filly and mare turf, kind of using this 9 furlong test to get some better gauge of her distance ability to stretch out. She is, I will just note, she's a half sister to Modern Games, and I know Godolphin, has these amazing pedigrees, and perhaps kind of having that in the back of their minds, thinking about how much success Modern Games had in the United States. Maybe that's one reason why they put her on this path. But it is something that I think you have to consider, that they are using this as a prep race.
Yes. You knew where I was going with that. What I ended up coming up with here was 3 horses on the top line, Elusive Princess, and I can't necessarily split a lot of the European form, and I thought her race in the at Saratoga was okay. It didn't wow me, but once again, I'm going to play into the jockeys just a little bit, and I think a local jockey is always an advantage, especially when you get the very top cream of the crop of the local jockeys. So I Pratt being on Elusive Princess sway me just a little bit, saying that that's kind of the baseline horse that I can use. I'm projecting that she'll get a good trip and he'll do the right things. So that's one I want to include. Maj is an obvious include, and maybe I'll do a little pressing with her because she appears to be the horse with the most talent. The other include for me was Sounds of Heaven, and I don't really have I did notice the Tahira, the common opponent. Sounds of Heaven showed that she could run with that horse, so that tells me she classes up. Also, just the ownership line there, a good friend of racing, Craig Bernick, being a part owner, tells me that the trainer's been instructed to be very serious about this race. I'm sure Craig would love to win this race, being a guy that spends a lot of time in Lexington. So I'm going to let that be my top line. The other three that I'm including as B's would be Lindy. Just impressed with the come home time in that last race. I thought that was excellent, and she should be helped by that prep. Alonda Queen would be another I would use as a B. And then I'm going to throw in a curveball. This is probably not the right spot for prerequisite, but if she does get a wide trip and this ends up being not a good race for her, I'm very interested in her coming back out of here. I just think she's an improving filly. She's probably overmatched here, but in the right spot, I could be very, very interested in her in the future.
Yeah, it's tough to separate these horses, and I'm just, based on some of the questions I have about whether or not they're using this race as a prep, and just the fact that English 1000 Guineas performance really came out of nowhere compared to her prior form. I know she had run well in Maidan, but Maj is a little bit of a question mark for me in this race. It's not a guarantee in my mind that she wants to go a mile and an eighth, and she also just seemed to handle the ground better. It was soft going at Newmarket when she beat Tahira. I believe that's the only loss of Tahira's win streak that she's had going since her 2-year-old season. She's one that I want to downgrade just a little bit because I don't see the value with her. Elusive Princess, I'm a little more on the fence about. I thought that she definitely caught the right field in the Saratoga Oaks last time, and the rainy conditions certainly didn't seem to bother her at all. She's a horse that has come from a little further back in the past and gotten into some trouble, at least earlier in her career in France, but she got the right trip last time at Saratoga. So, I mean, she's definitely usable for me. We'll see if she holds her form going into an American barn after being trained by her prior French trainer into her last race. Lindy is a horse that I'm very interested in for all the reasons that you guys are pointing out. Her last race did feel like it was just a prep. I don't love the field that she beat, but I do appreciate the way that she handled herself, and she really closed gamely in that French 1000 Guineas 3-back behind Blue Rose Sen, who is clearly the leader of the 3-year-old filly division in France this year. So definitely I think Lindy is a strong contender in this race. It's a little more on the fence about Sounds of Heaven. I thought that her big effort in the Coronation might have been a product of the pace. It just seemed like they were crawling along a little bit, and Tahira, even though she only won by a length, was just much the best that day. I'm glad Mike brought up Alonda Queen. I think she is an interesting one to consider because she seems a cut below from, just a time form rating perspective or even the grades of her races overseas at first glance. But watching some of her races, I do like the way she finishes, especially last time. She made a huge run down the center of the course from far back to get up, going away at the end. I like that they've named an American rider for her. These are very dangerous connections, so I think that she is a horse that I would consider as perhaps the biggest price of the Euros that are coming over for this race. And Mike, I echo everything that you said about the number 11 prerequisite. Craig will not be surprised to hear that she's a horse that I'm giving strong consideration to in this race. I had talked about how let's just say the lack of a plan last time in Lake Placid when she seemingly was rated, restrained off a pace that she arguably could have led, and just went 4 wide around both turns. I don't know how she was going to be successful with that trip, and indeed she wasn't. But she had shown form prior to that that's good enough to at least consider her in a spot like this, and I think the 9 furlong distance is right up her alley, and I have to think that the instructions to Irad, since there's no jockey change this time, that the instructions are going to be just to go forward and get over, and maybe stalk outside of Heavenly Sunday. And I think she's a horse that can outrun her odds with that kind of trip. And more meaningful than anything else is that Chad Brown is running her in this race, because Chad Brown doesn't have to run anybody in this race, and there are certainly boatloads of horses that could have been here instead of her. And the fact that he's taking a horse that was off the board in her last race and giving her this shot, I think it at least speaks to the fact that she must be doing well enough that they're expecting something better out of her. So at what's likely to be a big price, she's a horse that I definitely am going to use in this spot, but like Mike, I understand the challenges and will have an eye to potentially next time if she does get another wide trip in this race. Anything else that we should cover? I know we didn't mention that many of the American runners, but it does feel like the bulk of the quality here is among the Europeans. Craig or Mike, you can jump in if there's anything else you wanted to say about this race.
No, I would guess Papilio maybe might interest some people. She had kind of an odd trip in the Saratoga Oaks, but again, I didn't think that was the strongest field. And Elusive Princess basically blew her doors off once she got going, so I'm not going to be sucked into her. A horse who has shown that she is a bit odd anyway. She finds trouble. She tends to veer in at times, so she's not for me. And outside of that, I just don't see any of the other Americans being true contenders.
I agree with that, Craig. I just think the Euros are so strong here that I'm gonna take one or use a couple of horses with American races, and that's all I would need.
Let's close things out with the final leg of this sequence, race 10. It's an optional claiming 80,000 N2X lifetime, the allowance condition. Again, going this 1.1/16 distance on the main track with that short stretch run, and we've got another large field going this distance. But we've got a horse in here that I expect a lot of people are going to lean on in the last leg of this sequence, and probably justifiably so. That's the number 1, First Mission, a horse that showed a ton of ability earlier this year, just came right out running with a really fast speed figure, finishing second to his stablemate Bishop's Bay on debut. Easily broke his maiden, passed his first class test in the Lexington, beating a field that has proven to be legitimate since then. Obviously, well publicized. He was scratched from the Preakness, had a setback that week. It's taken him a few months to get back to the races, but this is the return spot that Brad Cox has picked out for him, and he's definitely the one they all have to get around. Craig, I'll throw it to you first. Do you see a path to beating this horse?
Well, he was my pick in the Preakness. Unfortunately, he scratched, as you noted, and probably changed the whole complexion of the Preakness as he had tactical speed, but that ship has sailed. So, how does he stack up here? He's always the kind of horse I want to try to beat if I can. I dug out the Brad Cox stats, and as you might expect, they're very good. I did 3-year-olds coming off a 6-month layoff in dirt routes. He's 45%, 9 for 20 with a 1.92 ROI. The ROI it doesn't matter to me because he wins a lot. He gets bet a lot. It's not a huge deal. What I found even more interesting when I sorted through that sample of 20, I looked at the horses that were under 2-1. Like this one is definitely going to be 2-1 or below. He was 9 for 12 with 2 seconds. So try to beat this horse at your own risk. I'm not going to concede the race totally, but he will be my lone A in here. It is a race that we looks like we think is going to have a fast pace, and I do think there is some other speed in here. So if I was going to use some backups, it would be horses who I think would come from off the pace a little bit, and there's a couple of those. I'll start with Cook Creek. He has some back races. He's a horse who has come from off the pace. He has tactical speed, but his best races have come when he sits a few lengths off and makes a late run, and he's a first-time gelding, so maybe he could improve off of that. The one I would even prefer to him is Creative Minister, a horse who didn't have much chance at Indiana last time in a race that didn't feature a lot of pace, but he has good figures and good form. So if it fell apart, I could see those two. But like I said, most of my play would go go through First Mission. I've spread in some other legs, and he's pretty reliable when you look at those Brad Cox stats. The one other horse I wanted to mention is the also eligible Airtime. Similarly, I looked up Theodoro's stats for layoffs. This was a horse who was very promising as a 3-year-old. Ran in the Arkansas Derby, didn't run bad, but unlike Brad Cox, the stats are not good for Diodoro. So in case this one draws in, I'm going to ignore him.
Yeah, Mike, what do you do with a horse like First Mission? Because, as Craig said, I mean, Brad Cox is one of the trainers that you generally have an inclination to trust in these situations. You know the horse has shown the ability to beat a field like this, but, I mean, there is that little bit of uncertainty about the setback that he had and coming off a layoff at what's going to be a very short price. I guess maybe it's added confidence that he drew the rail. How do you view the post position for this kind of race with a large field?
I love it, because I think there's no real true pace in here, and you have the perfect rider to take advantage of that. I think, Louis will just pop him out of the gate, and if somebody, goes on a mission to send for the lead, he'll lay second or maybe even set the pocket if a couple go. And if they don't and he can cruise on the front, he'll take advantage of that. And that's probably the most likely scenario, is just straight to the front. He's the fastest horse, probably the classiest horse. He has a tactical advantage. The only question is really you do have a 3-year-old going against older horses, but I think this time of year that is not a big concern for me. The only problem, the only concern at all is the layoff. And with Brad Cox, I'll pile on with some more formulator statistics. One of the great things about formulator is you can adjust that and customize it for whatever you're searching for. And I didn't break it down to 3-year-olds. I mean, that was impressive what Craig did there. That gives me more confidence. But I just did it on all dirt routes for Cox on 100 to 200 day layoffs, and he's winning at 34% with a 251 ROI. So I guess there should be no concern about the layoff. I guess it's just very hard to get past this horse. I have 3 other horses that I'm going to use and probably just as C's. There's one of them I'll mention first. Well, I'll mention him last. The 2 C's I'm going to use would be Keystone Field. And the only way I think these horses get there is just if First Mission is not on his game some way, or gets left at the gate, or something weird happens. But I just think Keystone Field, not a great horse, but he does jump up and throw a big race once in a while. And I think he will save ground. It'd be a good fit for IRAD, I think. And if I can see a scenario where he could possibly run. The other would be Creative Minister, for kind of what Craig said there. But the horse that I'm interested in, especially for the vertical gimmicks in this race, I don't really think he can beat First Mission if First Mission runs his race. But Roman Centurion, the 6th, for Sarah Hamilton, I followed this horse, and he's had 4 bad situations in a row. He's a 5-year-old, but he's only had 13 lifetime starts, and he's shown potential in some of these starts. The horse has a real finish, and he just keeps getting put in spots where either the pace or the bias or the trip, or sometimes multiple factors in the same race, have kept him from running his best, and he's still running pretty well. So I will play one small pick 5 where I single Roman Centurion and try to get some logicals to run in before that, just in case he does decide that today's the day.
Yeah, I'm find myself viewing this race very similar to the way that you guys are. It's just, it's really hard to get past First Mission. It's hard to build a case against him with another horse that you think is likely enough to win and going to offer the right kind of value to take that shot. I have no illusions that First Mission's going to get bet down off that even money line. He could be 2-5 in this race, but I mean, it just feels like a horse that you can lean on with some confidence in this final leg of the sequence because he's got the quality, and as you've been saying, he's supposed to get the right kind of trip. I mean, he's just shown that tractability and the tactical speed in those first couple of starts to give you confidence that he's going to be able to take advantage of this rail post position. So, I think he's the right kind of horse to have a lot of your play go through in this race, but I'm not the kind of person that's going to single any horse, so I do want to have some backups, and I pretty much agree with Mike here. I mean, I think we have the same horses. I also think Roman Centurion is an interesting horse to use. I am a little concerned that we're going to be having another one of those bad trips come his way because even though that pace projector is predicting a fast pace, I'm not exactly sure who it's going to be or who's going to go after First Mission early. It's a little murky. I mean, maybe Gunno goes from the 3-post position, but it does seem like there are a lot of mid-pack runners in this race, so it could get kind of congested in the middle of the pack, and we often see that occur in these mile and the 16th races at Keeneland, and just the short stretch. It doesn't seem like it's perhaps the best situation for this horse, but I do agree that if the trip works out, he's a horse that has the ability to get a big piece of this pie. We'll just see how that all goes. So he's a C. I would use Cook Creek as a C. Creative Minister is a C. I don't like Keystone Field as much as a horse, but I guess the post and the rider give him a chance to get a piece of this as well. But it is one of those situations where I do want to have most of my play going through First Mission, and I really only want to get alive to those C's if I'm right about one of my more outlandish opinions earlier. Like if I get that 20-1 shot home in the 1.5 mile race, then I want to have more coverage in this last leg. But it is a race where I think a lot of people are going to single First Mission, and I can't argue too hard against it. Well, we usually recap our feelings on a sequence, Craig and I, by doing just a brief discussion about how we would structure our tickets. I know in the past few years there's been a lot of discussion about ticket structure and how to go about it, the ABC method, as it's been termed, the caveman method, whether you're pressing certain tickets, playing multiple tickets. Mike, I know you talked a little bit about this the last time you were on, and you could sort of frame it in how you're approaching this week's sequence, but how are you looking at a pick 5 like this?
I wrote a book called Betting with an Edge, and in that book, I talked about value Bs. And a value B to me was a horse that not necessarily deserving of being on my top line, maybe. There were far more likely winners, but the price dictated that I give him a little more consideration, that I give him a consideration in some tickets, A-level consideration in some tickets. And while that sounds a little confusing, I think the Roman Centurion horse in the last race is a good example to use for that. So I'll play multiple themes in the same pick 5 sequence. So the bulk of my money is going to be mainly on the AB, in the AB framework, and I'm tweaking that a little, but I'm going to try to be right 4 out of the 5 times maybe, and then give myself a little leeway in that other leg that I'm not totally right in, to where I can still cash the ticket. And I'm not going to let EV override what I'm doing in some of the other legs. I'm going to focus the EV on the horse that I'm singling in those tickets. So Roman Centurion, for instance, in my way of thinking, I don't need another huge upset with him. I need my most logical winners. If I see an 8-1 as a logical winner, then of course he's an include. But I'll play a ticket with Roman Centurion, even though I think First Mission is by far the most likely winner in that race. I'll play a ticket with Roman Centurion using my very best opinions in the other legs, and maybe I'm spending 3 to 5% of what I'm going to play in the entire wager. It'll be a very small ticket, but I believe in taking the time to grind on that bet structure and include a few horses like your 20 to 1 shot that you're talking about in the 1.5 mile race. I like to bet a separate ticket where if that horse wins, here's how much I'm willing to spread in the other races based on the value that I perceive with the horse that I'm singling. So that's kind of my overall approach to any pick five.
I think that's great advice. And, sometimes this whole conversation gets too caught up in getting the positive EV out of every single race and putting those tickets together. And I guess that's not bad advice. I mean, it's a really hard thing to do and to be stringent about. And you're going to bet a lot of losing tickets doing that because your strike rate is going to be so much lower. And I mean, I guess in a way that's kind of how a lot of the CIW players do it. That's what the algorithms are programmed to do. But you're going to have a tough time beating them at that game. So I think, having the balance between grinding it out and getting those positive EV horses in your play, I think is the right strategy for a lot of players. So I think you framed that really well, Mike. As far as this sequence is concerned, I mean, you already covered it a little bit. Are there any horses that you want to specifically mention that you're going to use at a particular position? How large do you think your play is going to be for a sequence like this? Just comment a little bit on that, and then I'll throw it to Craig.
The bulk of my money will be played like this, and I hope I'll try not to make this take too long. But in race 6, I'll be my A's will be Lat Long and Dive Bomber. In race 7, 911 Turbo and Foreign Relations. In race 8, that's the hard one. I'm going to spread as much as I can in there, but and I'm going to incorporate some of your guys' ideas because I don't have strong opinions in that race. I'll do what I can there. I will definitely be using the 5, 9, 10, 11. That's in the pumpkin scone riff you gave there made a lot of sense too. But the 8th race is the race I just hope to survive. The 9th race, I will be using. I'll be using the 247 the most, with the 6, 8, 11 mixed in. In the last race, in 90% of my tickets, the First Mission will be single. So that's the way I'll play it. And then there'll be tickets with, if I'm right on what I just laid out there, if I'm right 4 times. The other leg, I will include my lesser opinions. So that's the way that I approach them. That's the way that Steve Chris and Andy Byer laid it out years ago. And I'm a dinosaur that idolized those guys and tried to emulate a lot of their methods. And to me, that's it. That's still the way that works best. And then I'll add on my own little touch of what we just discussed, of taking the EV horses that jump out to me, the ones that would really bother me if they won and I didn't cash the pick 5, and I'll play separate, real small tickets with those horses in addition to this AB basic framework that I'm using for the bulk of my money.
Craig, how about you? How are you looking to attack this sequence?
Yeah, just very briefly. I mean, I like what Mike said. Yeah, you want to look for value in a pick 5. I think it's impossible to do in every single leg. I don't know how often you're going to see 5 alleged overlays win in a row in a sequence. If you do, you're going to get a 5 or 6 digit payout most of the time. So I think you want to structure your tickets so that the overall ticket offers value. It's that's an opinion thing. You have to look for horses like we're talking about and focus on those. And I'll just kind of go through the horses that I liked in the sequence. I like Lat Long in that maiden race for McPeak, stretching out. Mike gave a formulator stat even better than mine, and I think that horse looks good. Dive Bomber's clearly the horse to beat. So those would be the two I'd focus on, and I'd also use Greer's Ferry as a backup. In the allowance race at a mile and a half on turf, I'm going to let the favorite beat me in that spot because I'm spreading in some other legs and just not a fan. So I'm going to key on Foreign Relations and Shirar as two that I really think are geared to a mile and a half like this race. And I'm also going to use Quadra Island, who's more of a B type horse, but it should be a big price, per 1 for 1 on turf. And I think the mile and a half will be fine. Like Mike, the eighth is very murky. I think he said with a capital M. A few horses I tossed out were Dear Lady. I mean, tossed out as uses were Dear Lady, who's got the top late pace rating, gets back to sprinting, has a little dirtied up form. Rarify, who Wesley Ward does very good in these kind of situations, but I would use several of the horses we talked about in varying degrees, trying to focus on price. In the QE2 Cup, it's the four main Euros for me, not so much the one that was coming out of the listed races. Um, I'm tending to lean on Lindy and Sounds of Heaven a little bit more than Maj and Elusive Princess, but they would be like A's and A minuses. I would use them almost in equal strength, not using any of the Americans. And then in the last race, I'm just going to focus most of my playthrough first mission. And if by some chance he does on much smaller tickets, if I'm right in the other legs of the sequence, I would use Cook Creek and Creative Minister.
Yeah, and for me, I'm probably going to press Door Knock a little bit in that first leg. I'd probably do him as the A and Lat Long and Dive Bomber as the two Bs. I think Dive Bomber is probably as likely to win the race as Door Knock, just from an ability standpoint, but the post position kind of is the separator for me between those two, and I just think Door Knock is much more likely to get the right trip in this race. So I'm going to give him the slight preference, and maybe on some very small tickets, I'll use horses like Play It Loud and Nuevo Empire as C types. In the seventh race, I'm going to upgrade my long shot, the number 2 Altazor, to A status. I just think he's a horse that is going to offer great value in this sequence. I think that he's unexposed in this kind of race. He's coming off one of the better performances of anybody in here. So I'm going to use him prominently, along with Foreign Relations. I'm going to probably use 911 Turbo, but more as a B-type horse. I don't want most of my play to go through him. Same for Sharar, who I think you guys like a little bit more than I do, but he's another horse that I think is a viable candidate in here. The number 10 Quadra Island, who I think Craig brought up, I get the case for that horse, and I think he's one with upside, so he's one that I could use as well, but I would be thrilled if I could be right about the number 2 in that leg. It would be setting me up for the rest of the sequence fairly well. In the 8th, I'm going to have most of my play go through 4 horses. Those would be Pumpkin Scone, Dear Lady, Zeitlos, and Rarify. They're kind of my 4 A's in this race, and I'm going to try to do that by narrowing down the other legs to having a thin A ticket alongside this 8th race. And then on backup tickets, I would throw in some of the fuzzy horses, like ones we didn't mention, like the number 1 Stellar Lily, who is a turnback, who got it coming off a fast workout last week at Churchill Downs, just a new face in the race that's a little interesting. And even the number 8 Little Blaze, who's got back form that makes her extremely logical in this spot and is just off a long layoff, and she's a bit of a question mark because of that, but I feel like, especially with the apprentice aboard, she's one that's probably going to drift up off that 6-1 line. I don't have confidence, I don't love her, but she's a horse that I could see winning this race at 15-1, and I'd want her on a backup ticket. In the 9th race, the QE2, tough to separate here. I'm going to lean towards the number 6 Lindy, the number 8 Alunda Queen, and the number 11 Prerequisite as my main horses, just from a value standpoint. So I'll kind of make them my A horses in the race, and then my B's would be Elusive Princess and Maj, because I think that they are the 2 most talented fillies in the field, just based on what they've shown. But they also feel like the 2 that are going to take the most money. So I'll kind of separate them in that way, letting the value be the separator for me. But those are the 5 that I want most of my play to go through in the QE2. And then closing things out, I think we already covered this race, how we're going to attack it. The number 1 first mission is the A, and for me, I would use just a few C's, Roman Centurion, Cook Creek, and Creative Minister. So, interesting sequence. I mean, there's a nice variety of races, favorites that are beatable, favorites that look pretty strong, and it's definitely one that I think from the standpoint of having a large budget or a small budget, you could put together a ticket for this sequence. And I think that's what you always want to see out of pick 5s like this, especially if you're playing them on a consistent basis. Mike, I want to thank you for coming on this podcast. Always enjoy getting the chance to talk to you. And I think you gave out some really great content and insights to the listeners. So just want to say thanks again for making the time.
I appreciate being on, and I always enjoy hearing you guys. And I always listen to your podcast every week to give me some ideas. And I always get a different slant on the races I'm looking at by listening to your ideas and your thoughts. So appreciate what you guys do.
Yeah, I appreciate you coming on, Mike. Always great to have you. I even go out of my way to listen to that awful Stewcast that we've all been on a time or two. But no, when you're on, I make it a point to listen. And of course, I'm just kidding. I love Alan. He's a great guy, and I can't wait to meet him. So great having you on, Mike, and look forward to doing it again.
Sounds great, guys.
Thanks, everybody, for listening this week. Craig and I, of course, will be back next week to do the TimeformUS Pacecast to recap a lot of these races, especially that Queen Elizabeth II Challenge Cup, as well as other stakes racing taking place in New York, California, and elsewhere. I think a lot of the Breeders' Cup preps have wrapped up by this point, and especially they will have after this QE2 is run on Saturday. But we'll talk about that and lay out some plans for how we're going to cover those Breeders' Cup races going into the latter portion of the month. Again, everybody, thanks for listening to the forecast this week. Remember, you can always catch these podcasts on DRF.com, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. Just make sure to subscribe to the Daily Racing Form channel. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to Mike for being the guest this week, and good luck to you this weekend.